Okay, I'm audible now. Okay, perfect. Okay, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima, and today I'll be walking you through my survival guide to being a junior engineer. But first, let me clarify what I mean by junior, because there's not really like a consistent definition of what a junior means in the industry. It can mean different things based on like the company that you work for. So I basically wanted to document my key learnings as I was moving to like the senior software engineer title. So when I say junior, it basically encapsulate everything before that. So I'm talking about maybe like the first 2 to 3 years of your career. But first, why this topic? So when I reflect back on my experiences as a software engineer, I feel that my biggest learnings have been in the non-technical parts of the job. There's so much unexplored territory that goes beyond the algorithmic requirements of your job, and these soft skills are extremely important in determining your success as a software engineer. This unexplored territory is also where I feel that our classrooms somewhat fail us. We're sent to the workplace primed to pass technical interviews, but we're not primed to be successful in our roles as software engineers. And that's because there's such a huge component to being a successful software engineer that we're not exposed to at all. Did anyone tell you how much ambiguity you were going to be dealing with? Were you taught about the complexities of project planning? Were you taught on how to identifying potential risks and how to mitigate them? Were you advised on what to do when an engineer leaves a project midway? I'm fairly sure that none of us here were. I feel that there's this undeniable delta that exists between what we're taught in school and what's needed to be successful in the industry. And my session is an attempt to bridge that delta. Similarly, once I started working in the industry, I felt that most of the career-related content that I was coming across happened to be about how to go from one senior level to another, and no one really talked about what to do in the middle. There's some like excellent literature available out there for senior engineers and how to navigate your career beyond that. Similarly, there's tons of resources that help you break into tech and get those new grad roles. But again, there's not much conversation centered on what happens between those two points, right? Where you've just started off your career, but you're not yet a senior. How are you supposed to navigate your career then? So without further ado, let's get started. So now that we've talked about the what and why, let's quickly talk about the who. I'll introduce myself and what makes me qualified to speak on this subject. I'm a senior software engineer at Yelp, and for those of you that don't know, Yelp is, we basically do crowdsourced reviews for businesses. We like to target local and small businesses in particular. They're based in San Francisco. They started off in 2004, and over the past 2 decades, they've grown to have quite a significant presence in primarily North America, London, Germany. We're a remote-first company, and because of that, I work out of Montreal, Canada. On a side note, Yelp is honestly an amazing place to work, so if you are looking for a new role, I would highly recommend checking them out. Before Yelp, I was working as a software developer at a trading firm called DRW. They're based in Chicago, but again, they had a pretty big presence in Montreal. Going back even further, I completed 4 internships as part of my undergrad at the University of Waterloo, Canada, and I'm also wrapping up a master's in data science. I should hopefully be done by the end of this year. Before we proceed, a disclaimer that any opinions or views expressed in this session are my personal opinions and do not represent those of my employer. Okay, so we'll start off with a story. Over a year ago, I started on the biggest project of my career. This was basically a huge refactor that we were doing, and the goal was to have a better architecture, better user experience, etc. Now, this project involved multiple teams, but it was primarily my team that was at the heart of it. Now, I never worked on a project of this size before with this many stakeholders, and I was pretty new to Yelp at that point as well, so I was understandably very nervous, but very excited at the same time. I knew this project would present a tremendous learning opportunity for me, even more so because I was going to be working directly with 2 technical leads, something that I was incredibly excited about. These tech leads were also sort of the 2 engineers who'd come up with the original concept for the refactor. So again, I felt that this was going to be an incredible learning experience and sort of like directly learning from the source. Now, the first couple of months of the project were fairly straightforward, but things got interesting around the mid-year mark, which is when 3 of the 5 engineers who were working on this project left. This included both the technical leads who left within 2 months of each other. You can imagine that this was not at all a part of my plan. Never in my wildest imagination had I accounted for this. We were about 60% done by the time the 3 team members left, but the remaining 40% was the really tricky part because this was when we were going to start getting all the changes together, start rolling them out, see how metrics were being impacted. So this was really the time when we would be able to assess whether the project was a success or not. Now, obviously, there was this huge vacuum that was created when these engineers left. And even though there were 2 of us remaining, I was sort of the only engineer who had worked on this project throughout. So I was then made the project lead. You can imagine my excitement. Because of the circumstances, I like to call myself an accidental project lead. But anyway, we still had work to do, so we got around to it. Another aspect of this project, which makes it so special for me, is that this was also the same time around which I was being considered for a promotion. So you can understand that in addition to dealing with the changing team dynamics, I also had to sort of balance the political angle of the promotion. I knew that there was a promotion on the line, so I had to really understand what was expected of me, what I was expected to deliver, in addition to balancing all these other externalities that I had absolutely no control over. So given everything that was at stake, in the beginning, it did feel like I had sort of been thrown into the deep end and I was expected to navigate the deep waters myself. Long story short, we did end up delivering the project, even though it was a bit delayed, but that was okay given the circumstances. The project was a resounding success, but again, because of the unique circumstances in which we delivered it in, it sort of forced me to take a step back and reflect back on everything that I'd learned up to that point, which is what brings me here today. There's some key learnings that I wanted to share in the aftermath of this experience. So this is a rough outline of the various focus areas that we'll be discussing in the next couple of slides. We'll start off by discussing the importance of embracing ambiguity as an engineer. Actively embracing ambiguity is an inevitable part of being an engineer. I think this has to be one of the biggest lessons that I've learned as I've grown as an engineer. I like to think that this is pretty similar to how you progress from a child to a teen to eventually an adult. As a child, you're instructed to do certain things. Your day is pretty much dictated by the adults around you. However, as you move into the teenage and eventual adult years, that degree of instruction reduces and you're pretty much left to your own devices. I like to think that my experience as an engineer is pretty similar in that regards. When you're an intern or a new grad engineer, you rely on the senior engineers or your manager to tell you what to do. By the time a task gets to you, all or most of the ambiguity has been removed from it, right? And that's because it's undergone multiple iterations and discussions as part of project planning, and what gets to you is a small, achievable, deliverable subtask. This already simplifies a large degree of the work for you. I still remember that back when I was an intern, my manager would have this nice long list of Jira tasks that I needed to complete, and that was pretty much it. There wasn't too much ambiguity that I needed to stress over. Similarly, I always hear a lot of junior engineers talk about that, oh, I worked on X number of tickets this week, and at this point in my career, I always find that a bit funny because as a senior engineer, there's no assigned tickets. You're the one who's creating those tickets. However, something that I've observed as I become more senior is that over time, the ambiguity starts increasing, and that's because as you're moving up the seniority, you're becoming a part of the very initial stages of the project. Think of the project in terms of a timeline with the start and end denoted by conception and execution, respectively. Conception is on one extreme end, with execution being on the other end. Now, what I mean by conception is basically putting forward proposals for technical initiatives or endeavors that you feel your team or company should undertake. As you become more senior in your role, you start moving from the execution end and more towards the conception end. The closer you are to the conception end, the more ambiguity you're going to be dealing with, and that can be quite challenging. You're likely going to be overseeing multiple services, and as your scope increases, so does the amount of ambiguity. To even identify a certain technical endeavor, you need to be familiar enough with different services. You can only identify potential improvements if you have enough context. If I'm being completely honest, I think this has to be one of the more challenging parts of my role. Having to break down a goal into, that you want to accomplish into smaller, measurable, and achievable subtasks is pretty difficult. I have a ton of respect for all my previous managers now because project planning is no joke. You can be as excited and enthusiastic about your project as you want, but unless you're able to look past the ambiguity and share a definitive project plan with your stakeholders, you're probably not going to get the green light to proceed. This is also where your understanding of the project will come in handy. The clearer your comprehension is of the what and why, the easier it will be for you to translate that ambiguity into the how with clear and actionable items. It's important to realize that learning how to deal with ambiguity is an acquired skill and doesn't just happen overnight. While you're learning how to deal with ambiguity, I also encourage getting buy-in from other senior engineers working on the project. It's always incredibly helpful to leverage their experience. Embracing ambiguity goes hand in hand with lesson number 2, which is to understand your project inside and out and its value to the business. You must understand the project as thoroughly as possible because this will inevitably tie into the project's overall success. The better you understand it, the better you'll be able to define what needs to be done, identify potential risks and blockers, testing needs, and overall have more accurate estimates of project timelines. A big part of your understanding is also being cognizant of the value you bring to the business. How is this initiative contributing to the overall goals of the company? Is the focus on accuracy or latency or both? How can revenue be potentially impacted? Knowing these details might sound absurd from an engineering perspective, but a certain degree of understanding regarding the business value goes a long way towards the project's overall success. As an engineer, we always like to think about a project from a technical perspective, right? We think about overall latencies. We think about testing the happy paths versus the not so happy paths. We think about design patterns and the right way to implement a feature, among other things. But as an engineer, have you ever thought about revenue? Have you ever thought about how a faulty change could lead to a degraded user experience, which would inevitably be detrimental to your business's revenue? This is something that I've actively started thinking about as I've become more senior in my role, and this is something that most of us are inevitably going to do as well. As you get to work on more high-stakes projects and as you gain more visibility in your role, your mistakes could start becoming more costly. The point of this discussion is not to scare you from making mistakes. That's an inevitable part of your growth as an engineer. Lord knows I've broken production so many times, and I really do think that breaking prod is like a rite of passage for most engineers. But what I want to stress on is the importance of being cognizant of the cost of those mistakes so you can learn to mitigate the risk accordingly. Think about it this way. An inexperienced engineer will deploy an experiment at any time of the day without thinking about traffic patterns or without thinking about how they can potentially mitigate the risk if their change is faulty. An experienced engineer, on the other hand, will know not to deploy on Fridays, will know not to deploy during high traffic times, or when there is an ongoing outage. Now, at this point, you're actively working on embracing the ambiguity within your project work. You have an understanding of the project and its value to the business. So next, let's talk about the complexities of project planning. Now, before I get into the complexities of project planning, I want to preface this by sharing the experience that led to this learning. So going back to my original story, when 3 of the 5 project members left within a couple of months into starting the new project, and I was then made a project lead, one of the first things that I needed to do was to sort of regroup and share a new project timeline with my stakeholders, because the project was understandably going to be delayed. Now, I'd never done this before, so using whatever little context I had and whatever my understanding of the current state of the project was, I shared a new completion date for the end of November. This was hilariously over-optimistic, and that was mostly because I had completely forgotten to account for vacation days. Thanksgiving in the US happens towards late November, and that also happens to be around the same time where a lot of people take their vacation days because it's so close to Christmas season, and I'd completely forgotten to account for that. Luckily, this mistake wasn't too costly because I later found out that my manager had added some buffer time into the November end deadline, and the completion date that had been shared with stakeholders had been for after New Year's. Needless to say, I was very grateful to my manager for having my back. This brings me to my first lesson with regards to effort estimation and timelines. These are very difficult tasks. How do you estimate how long each task is going to take? How do you determine if tasks can be done in parallel or whether they need to be done in a serial fashion? There's so many times where you have a tentative project timeline in mind, but it ends up getting delayed because a feature that you thought would only take you 3 days to complete ended up taking 2 weeks because you ran into some unforeseen issues. But here's the thing. Your timelines aren't meant to be perfect, but it's important to be realistic with them. You have to consider the fact that you're working with teammates that have families, friends, and a life outside of work, so you have to account for vacation days, wellness days, last-minute time off, civic holidays, people resigning, or any other urgent task that might come up. Another very important part of project planning is realizing that nothing is set in stone and that things can change. For example, people can leave a project midway, which is what happened to me. Company priorities can shift, leading to projects being canceled. Changes in economic conditions can trigger massive changes in strategy. While there's no way to predict any of these, and while changes like these can truly feel very earth-shattering, they present a tremendous learning opportunity in terms of showing more initiative, taking on more ownership of projects, or assuming a leadership role. Going back to when both my tech leads left, for a while, I sort of lost my bearings. I didn't really know what to do. While the tech leads were there, I sort of always used to feel as if there was like an adult in the room, right? Like when you have more senior engineers working with you, it's sort of very easy to shift responsibility towards them. You sort of feel that, if in case anything goes wrong, they're there, so they'll know what to do. But once they left, I was sort of the new adult in the room, and people now look to me to have all the answers. As scary as that time was, I don't think there's ever been a time in my career where I've had such unprecedented growth. To summarize the complexities and unpredictability of project planning, I would like to remind you of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. The eternal optimist in me has begrudgingly accepted this, and it'll do you good to acknowledge this as well. Coming to terms with this will make you a better project planner, though, because you'll know to add buffers in your timelines and have contingency plans in case something goes awry. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had this experiment that I was ready to turn on just before logging off for the day. I was all set, everything was in place, and I was really excited because the experiment would run overnight. I would collect some logs, and I'd have data ready the next morning. Sounds like a perfect plan, right? So I mentioned this in my team sync, and my manager just very casually reminded me to not turn on the experiment in case something came up. I agreed, but internally I was like, what's going to come up? Nothing's going to go wrong. I've tested the changes. There's very minimal risk, so everything should go very smoothly. As luck would have it, I was then alerted of an ongoing outage, because of which all experiments were currently blocked. So much for my perfect plan. There is no such thing. Next, let's talk about communication as an engineer. Now, communication is one of the core pillars of being a successful engineer. We've all been taught that. But most of the time when we talk about communication, we envision verbal communication, so I'll talk about that first. Now, I don't need to tell you that you need to be good at communication, because it's one of those things that's constantly drilled into us when we're prepping for technical interviews. But there is something in particular that I want to bring your attention to, which is realizing the audience that you're addressing and the level of detail that you're expected to share with them. For example, if I'm addressing my team and I'm sharing project updates, I'll probably go into some of the technical details. Again, this depends on whether I'm talking to people who are actively working on the project or versus people that aren't. So in a case like this, you sort of use your judgment to decide what that level of detail is that you want to share. On the other hand, if I'm addressing my stakeholders, they're probably not interested in those low-level technical details, and they likely need more of a bird's eye view or a big picture view of the current state of the project. Getting that level of detail just right is a very important component of communication, both verbal and written. Secondly, just like we're taught to ask clarifying questions before getting started on a technical problem within an interview, make sure to do the same with your project work as well. It's always better not to make certain assumptions and to clarify before you get started on your project. I remember working on this task that took me 3 days to complete, and I'd done all my work based on an assumption that I'd made. 3 days later, I was told that the assumption was completely incorrect to begin with, and I basically had to redo the entire task. That's 3 days of development work wasted and a further X number of days that it took me to redo the whole thing. Next, be very transparent and proactive in conveying blockers and expected delays. Now, this one is a bit tricky because this can sometimes also mean admitting to your own mistakes, and it's your mistake that's pushing the project forward. I've been in a situation where, again, I was working on this experiment, and we were, the point of that experiment was to basically just collect some logs. And then these logs were then going to be used to conduct an investigation. One day after turning on the experiment, I realized that the experiment actually wasn't working as expected, and the logs that we had collected over that one day were not useful at all. I realized this on Friday morning, and I started freaking out because this was a very high visibility project, and it had already been delayed for quite a while as it was. I must have debated sharing this bug with my team at least 100 times. But I did eventually end up sharing it with my team that day. Not only was there no finger pointing, but my manager was able to escalate this issue. We were able to quickly put a team together to implement a fix. And before I logged off for the day, we had a fix ready to be rolled out on Monday. Escalating issues promptly can get you the help you may not even realize you need. Moving on, politely ask people to repeat themselves if you're unsure, especially in meetings. A lot of the times, most people will be wondering the same thing, but because of diffusion of responsibility, no one ends up asking those questions. Similarly, if it was a very long meeting and a lot of things were discussed, take meeting minutes and do a quick review at the end where you summarize what was discussed, if there's any follow-up items, and what action items were assigned to what team member. Lastly, I want to very quickly mention the importance of documentation, which is something that engineers usually dread doing, myself included. When we're working on a project, everything is very fresh in our memory, so it's very easy to recall commonly used commands that you use for debugging or for testing your code. If you're executing commands to the terminal, you can very easily access the last couple of commands that you've run. That might work when you're actively working on the project, but say you go on an extended PTO, or you finish the project and you just need to do some minor bug fixes a couple of weeks later. Searching through those previously executed commands is going to be a lot more difficult this time. I'm guilty of having done this myself. There's been so many times where I've had to sift through Slack conversations trying to find out the commands that I need. Documentation as you go along can save you potential headaches later on. Now, the next lesson that I want to talk about is acknowledging that context switching is an unfortunate but a very real part of our day-to-day job as software engineers. Context switching, as you might recall from your operating systems classes, is when the processor pauses the execution of a task to execute another task before switching back. Now, a computer can do this very efficiently. The human brain, on the other hand, cannot. So every time that you do a context switch, not only are you losing focus, but it's also very detrimental to your developer productivity. According to an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, a programmer takes between 10 to 15 minutes to start editing code after resuming work from an interruption. An uninterrupted task is estimated to take twice as long and contain twice as many errors as uninterrupted tasks. And a programmer is likely to get just one uninterrupted 2-hour session in a day. That's pretty bad. Now, back to your student days, if you thought that 90% of your day as a software engineer would be you hunched in front of a screen, happily coding away, I hate to break it to you, but your day is going to be a far cry from that. What a realistic day in your life looks like is that you're going to get started, you're going to start getting back to emails and messages, you'll start coding at some point. Then let's say you have a stand-up. The stand-up is only 15 minutes long, but there's some action items that were assigned to you, and you need to go talk to people from a couple of other teams. You send messages to those other team members, and then you go back to your coding task. Those other team members get back to you, and then you get pulled into those conversations. Then add in an hour for lunch. If you're working from home, there can be a knock on the door, there could be errands that you need to take care of, and again, so many other interruptions. Lo and behold, at the end of the day, a fix that you thought would only take you 15 minutes ends up taking you the entire day. Now, I've worked long enough in tech to realize that it's unrealistic to expect that there's not going to be any context switching during your day. So the question is not on how you get rid of it altogether. The question is more on how do you reduce it. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that not all context switching is necessarily bad. And what I mean by that is that there's different ways in which you could be context switching, right? For example, if you're getting distracted by your social media apps, that's for sure something that you want to eliminate. However, if a coworker messages you and they need your help, or say you're an on-call engineer and you got paged, those are undeniable parts of your job that you can't really say no to. So my first suggestion would be to categorize the different ways in which you're context switching. The likely culprits will be meetings, which understandably take up a large portion of our days, social media apps, which I'm sure we're all guilty of, work-related emails, or other conversations or messages via Slack or Teams or whatever it is that you use for internal communication. Next, check which one of these can be potentially eliminated. Do you need to be present for all the meetings on your calendar? There might be a couple that you can skip and you can just get by reading the meeting notes. Your social media apps, for example, those can surely wait until the end of the workday. Next, consider things like time blocking and time batching. This basically means that you do focused, uninterrupted, or deep work in like chunks of time, basically. So for example, when you start your day, you could set aside like an hour in which you're just getting back to your emails or messages. You could set aside another hour where you're just getting back to your code reviews. And then maybe you could set like a 2-hour chunk of time where you're just focusing on coding. Similarly, another practice that we have in my team is that we have meeting-free Wednesdays, which I really enjoy because it gives me like a solid day to do some very focused work without being interrupted by any meetings. I'm also a very big fan of prioritized to-do lists. Something that I really like doing on Sunday nights, which is when I start feeling this impending sense of doom, is that I like dumping everything that I need to do on my to-do list. This includes anything from like work-related tasks to making payments or getting groceries. Next, I categorize these tasks according to work, school, personal, etc. And finally, I set a priority to each task. Setting the priority is the most important part of this entire activity because this is how I organize my week, right? Mondays can be overwhelming for a vast majority of people, myself included, but I always feel more in control and more well-prepared because I know that I have an exact plan of attack. Next, let's move to the last and final lesson of this session. What I want to talk about here is realizing that technical debt might be a necessary evil. Now, when I first started off as an engineer, I had very strong opinions on tech debt. I even remember expressing my opinion very strongly in an interview, and needless to say, I didn't get the job. My naive undergrad version thought that debt in general carries a very negative connotation, so I assumed that the same held true for tech debt as well. Now, tech debt is basically the cost of getting it done as opposed to doing it right. It includes things like a last-minute hacky fix, poor or a complete lack of documentation, a poor testing suite, among other things. You can think of tech debt as the number of to-dos in your code base. Similar to context switching, it's unrealistic to expect not to have any tech debt. There's definitely circumstances where it's necessary to take on this debt, but there's two things that I like to keep in mind with regards to tech debt. Number one, taking it on should be a conscious decision. it needs to be intentional. And secondly, you need to be cognizant enough to pay it off in a timely manner. Accumulating tech debt can lead to a slowdown in development work, or worse, having to rewrite the entire application. So, what do you do when you get to the fork in the road where you have a choice between getting it done versus doing it right? First, and this ties into my earlier point about understanding the value that you're bringing to the business, be very clear on what's important. Is getting the feature out on time more important, or is rolling it out with little to no issues more important? This is going to determine whether you decide to take on tech debt. Get buy-in from senior engineers. Leverage their experience and expertise. They might be able to provide alternatives to taking on tech debt. Secondly, if you do take on tech debt, remember to pay it off. And that doesn't mean just making a mental note of it. That means that you include it as a part of your backlog. If you have a project like completion checklist, include it as part of your project completion criteria. Your project isn't complete until you've paid off tech debt. Don't treat working on tech debt like a second-class citizen. This is as important as any other task in your backlog. Working on improving documentation or your test suite doesn't make you any less of an engineer. Appreciate and acknowledge team members that work on paying down tech debt. We have a ritual in our team where every week we give a shout out to any engineer who paid off some sort of tech debt. Don't play the blame game and don't point fingers. If you've taken on tech debt, own up to it. If you want your tech debt to be taken seriously, you need to quantify it as well. What did that lack of a test suite result in for the business? Maybe the missing test suite caused you to roll out a feature 1 week later than expected. That's you quantifying your tech debt. Was it a loss of revenue because you rolled out a faulty feature? If so, how much revenue? Next, share your knowledge. If you've paid off tech debt and you've noticed some consistent themes in the tech debt that you've paid off, share your learnings with your team to prevent future occurrences of the same issue. On a similar note, establish coding standards. A lot of the times, just because there's no standards established, there's no standards that are established, there's room for sloppy execution. So establish these standards and make sure that they continue to be enforced through code reviews, for example. Lastly, one of the trickiest parts about tech debt is that it can be this very vicious cycle. You have a badly written application, but it works, so no one bothers to do a refactor. Why fix it if it's not broken, right? Additionally, a refactor might also not sound as appealing from a business value perspective, and there's no denying that refactors definitely carry a lot of risk as well. If it's a choice between developing a new feature versus a refactor, the former will most likely be given preference. Now, over time, that badly written application keeps getting bigger, so the tech debt keeps on increasing until you get to the point where it's actually become difficult to add to the application, just because of how badly written it is. This is that point of no return that you want to avoid. The solution here is to do and prioritize refactors before your application gets to this point of no return. So, to recap, these are the key takeaways from this session. Embracing the ambiguity within your role, understanding your project inside and out and its value to the business, acknowledging that project planning is complex and that nothing is set in stone, practicing clear, effective, and efficient communication, acknowledging that context switching is an unfortunate but inevitable part of your role, and lastly, realizing that technical debt might be a necessary evil. But yeah, that brings me to the end of my session. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them right now. But yeah, thank you for attending my session.